We'll be looking specifically at how an accelerated move to electric vehicles can help combat climate change, asking questions such as what's the best way to help drivers go green, what role can industry play in widening access, and where can government policy have the most impact in supporting and encouraging the transition to electric vehicles. And with me to discuss these areas, I'm delighted to be joined by Rachel Maclean, Minister for the Future of Transport and Decarbonisation, Jamie Heywood, General Manager for the UK, Northern and Eastern Europe Uber, Peter Mather, Group Regional President for Europe for BP, and Ginny Buckley, CEO and founder of electrifying.com and a journalist. So to start off, I'm going to ask each panellist to speak for 5 to 10 minutes to give their thoughts on the theme of the discussion, and then shortly afterwards we'll be looking at audience Q&A, so do feel free to get involved. So, so I'm going to ask, as Rachel's, she's on her way to her broadcast destination, so I'm going to ask Jamie to start off first of all.
Sure, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Just checking that works.
We can. Hi, Jamie.
Hi there. Hi, Rachel. Yeah, so I'm representing Uber here today, and we're very conscious that as a key player in the UK's transportation industry, we're a representative of an industry that remains the UK's largest emitting sector, responsible for over a quarter of all greenhouse gases, and it's also a sector where emissions have been increasing rather than decreasing over the last 10 years. And therefore it's critical to us, and it's crystal clear to us, that transportation has to move and play a role in combating climate change, and that a critical part of this is accelerating the transition to electric vehicles. I joined Uber about 2.5 years ago, and one of the key things that I did just after joining was making the commitment to be fully EV in London across all 45,000 of our drivers in London by 2025. And the work we started in London 2 years ago is now at the forefront of some of Uber's global efforts. And so I was very proud when in September we made a commitment to be a zero emissions mobility platform across Europe and North America by 2030. And that we committed that drivers on the Uber app would receive more than $800 million to support them in this transition to electric vehicles. And one of the reasons why we're pushing electrification so hard at Uber is that we believe that the mass adoption of EVs will start with professional drivers. And that's likely to happen, firstly, because they drive more kilometers a day. So actually the cost of not getting them into EVs is higher, but also because the EV economics work for them first. And when I say EV economics, I mean the fact that although electric vehicles still cost more upfront, their running costs per kilometer driven or per day driven are cheaper, which means that the break-even point when it's advantageous to transition works first for drivers who drive a lot, that is professional drivers. So we think that by driving adoption of professional drivers, we can get the EV flywheel spinning. So getting car sales, increasing the sale of electric vehicles, which will drive EV pricing down, and that will create investment opportunities to invest in more charging infrastructure, which in turn encourages more and more people to upgrade into EVs. Now, what's Uber doing in this area? If I quickly cover a few of the things we're doing. Firstly, we've launched the Clean Air Fund in London in January 2019. And since then, we've raised more than £100 million to support drivers in transitioning. So each driver who drives in London will be paid for the kilometers they drive, and that will then go into a savings pot that they have to help them transition to electric vehicles. So we're confident that in the next 2 years, the average Uber driver in London will have saved more than £4,500 to help them transition to an EV. what we're also doing is we're trying to give customers greener options. So that includes launching Uber Green, which will be an EV-only product, which we plan to do in London in 2021, but also giving passengers options of other cleaner modes of transport. So that includes bikes, and you will have seen our jump bikes and also now Lime bikes on the app, shared vehicles through our pool product, and also links to public transport so that you can get bus times and tube times through the app. We're also working hard with industry, with manufacturers, to try and make sure that drivers get access to big battery cars at reasonable prices. So we're very conscious that for professional drivers, any hour spent charging during the day is an hour that they could have been earning. And so critical is getting 60 kilowatt or more batteries at affordable prices, because that's when they can do a full day's driving on a single overnight charge. So we're working with Nissan, who manufacture in Sunderland, as well as Hyundai and Tesla, to try and make sure that drivers have a good range of vehicles to spend their money on when they choose to upgrade. For us, the biggest pain point, though, because actually I think the vehicle side, we're fairly optimistic that we have line of sight into big battery vehicles and access to them. Biggest concern is EV infrastructure. And this is, we've done quite a lot in this area. So we announced about 3 weeks ago a partnership with BP ChargeMaster, the UK's leading charge point operator for electric vehicles, to provide drivers with reliable, affordable access to charging across London. But the real issue is overnight charging, which is optimal, the best way of charging for everyone. It's best obviously for drivers because they're charging overnight where they don't have to lose earning time. It's also best for the vehicle because the battery life is lengthened. And it's best for the grid because it's charging when the grid is not full. But 85% of our drivers in London don't have access to off-street parking. So that means the overnight charging problem really needs to be addressed through finding public charging options and increasing public charging options near where drivers live. So we've made progress so far. We do roughly 40,000 EV trips every week in London, and since we launched the Clean Air Plan, we've done more than 8 million EV miles. But we're very conscious that we can't do this alone, and that climate action is a team sport, not an individual sport. And so what we've been doing is we've been working closely and sharing our data with many experts across the UK and also across Europe, including transport and environment, and also World Economic Forum, to try and develop detailed policy proposals that we believe governments and cities should implement to try and accelerate the rollout of EVs. And these policy proposals are summarized in our new report, which I'd be happy to send you after the conference, which is called Spark: Partnering to Electrify Europe. And if I highlight maybe just 3 of the proposals that it includes, though in the end there's approximately 10. The first one is ensuring that drivers have access to overnight charging near home to eliminate the opportunity cost of having to charge during the day. And we talk in the report a lot about some of the right to charge model that they have in Netherlands, where the government provides a guarantee to citizens that they can get access to a charger near home within a fairly finite period of making a request. And what we've seen as a result of this commitment from government is the Netherlands has double the number of chargers on a smaller population than we have in the UK. And EVs are representing almost 10% of all new car sales in 2019. Second policy commitment is that we believe cities and governments should try and make is to make sure that drivers have access to longer range EVs at reasonable prices. And that really includes trying to stimulate the second-hand car market. So many of our drivers will not be driving new vehicles at the moment. They'll be driving Used Toyota Priuses, for example, is our most common model. And therefore the upgrade into an EV requires, firstly, the upgrade from an ICE vehicle to an EV, and secondly, the upgrade from a second-hand to a new vehicle, which makes the increase in cost very expensive. So on average, they'd have to spend an additional £20,000 to get from a used ICE into a new EV. And so therefore, anything governments and cities can do to really try and stimulate the second-hand car market eliminates, or at least reduces, one of those two steps that drivers have to take. And then the third policy area that we would encourage cities and governments to look at is trying to close the remaining total cost of ownership gap, either through raising EV subsidies or through trying to create disincentives for ICE vehicles to drive around. And this is critical because unless the cost of upgrading to an EV is kept broadly the same as today for professional drivers, it won't be a fair transition. Where it will hit them is in their earning power. And we think a really good model of how a city government has done this is actually London's CCZ and ULEZ, where actually by creating differential charging for petrol vehicles versus EV vehicles, it creates a strong incentive for drivers to upgrade into an EV. So given where we are and given the economic impact of a pandemic, there are difficult choices. But at Uber, we're very committed to trying to make sure that we allow cities and the country to build back better and to build back into a greener future. And we're very open to talk to anyone who would like to work with us to use our data or use some of the learnings we have from the UK and the other countries where we're trying to play a role in transitioning our drivers and our platforms to EVs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. And Peter, can we go over to you?
Just coming off mute, that famous phrase that we've all been using all year. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you, Jamie. I'll be reasonably brief. I mean, this has been an extraordinary year in many ways for all of us. It's also been a fairly extraordinary year for us in BP. We have a new CEO, a new strategy, a new direction that is really quite different from the past, and we've laid out our stall to change from what used to be called an international oil company, an IOC, to an integrated energy company, an IEC. On the 12th of February, and then with follow-up presentations since then, our new CEO announced our ambition to be a net zero company by 2050 or sooner. So hopefully any sort of lingering doubts about whether a company like BP was serious about this agenda have now gone, because we have laid out a very, very clear plan and commitments and ambitions to get us there. So we followed up that February launch of the overall ambition with a lot more detail recently, particularly in August, with some specific targets, for example, reducing our oil and gas production by 40%. Yes, 40% by 2030, a tenfold increase in our low carbon investments from £500 million to £5 billion by 2030 or sooner, and also an ambition to develop renewable power generation up to about 50 gigawatts, a 20-fold increase from where we are today. But one of the things we also committed to, which is relevant for this discussion, is an increase in our charge points for electric vehicles. We're currently about 7,500 today, mainly in the UK, and we've said we'll increase that to 70,000, so near tenfold increase by 2030 or sooner. So you can see that we're extremely committed to the electrification agenda. We're very committed to electric vehicles. Most of, as I say, of those 7,500 charge points are currently in the UK, delivered by BP Chargemaster, whom Jamie mentioned just now, which is actually the UK's largest public charging network that we acquired in 2018. And I do remember people at the time saying, "Oh, you're just buying that so you can shut it down." Well, hopefully, no. Everybody realizes we bought BP Chargemaster to grow it, and to grow it hard, and to work with others on the electrification agenda. So by 2030, we aim to have more than doubled the number of charge points in the UK to around 16,000, with a 30-fold increase in kilowatt hours of electricity sold to our customers. Last year, we launched ultra-fast chargers because, as Jamie says, it's really important that if you can't charge at home, at least you can charge quickly out of home at a retail site or a public charging point. So we rolled out ultra-fast chargers at our retail forecourts. Currently, there are about 35 of the 150 kilowatt chargers on around about 18 of our forecourts, and we plan to roll out a further 1,400 ultra-fast chargers by 2030. And just to give you some context, one of our 150 kilowatt ultra-fast chargers provides customers with around 100 miles driving range for after 10 minutes of charging time. So not dissimilar from the sort of experience you currently get filling up an internal combustion engine. Obviously, we're very, very focused on the customer experience. You'd expect me to say that because we do obviously have an extensive retail network where we're building out the BP Chargemaster offer, but we've also installed over 60,000 home charge units to date, and one of the UK's leading providers of these home charging units, and recommended by about 13 vehicle manufacturers in the UK. But we can't do all of this alone, and it's great to see Jamie there because we recognise that we've got to work in partnership. I think the whole climate agenda needs all of us to be working in partnership all the time. Nobody has a silver bullet. We certainly don't. The Polar Workplace offer that BP Chargemaster put out there is a great opportunity for fleets and businesses to work with us. And I think, you know, as Jamie said, there's a real low-hanging fruit, I think, in electrifying fleets and business transport offer. But we're really excited about the partnership with Uber, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. So just sort of in conclusion, what are the challenges? Well, I mean, there are a number of challenges. I think the grid connection costs clearly are an issue for all of us in the marketplace who are wanting to put in extra charging points, and not only transparency of costs, but also probably we need to standardize a little bit more the approach, because it can be a little bit random in different places. I think the application process, I hope we can speed that up, because one of the things we need to deliver the sort of vision that Jamie was talking about is to build pretty quickly, actually, to scale up pretty quickly the charging points in the UK, to give that confidence. And this is all about giving confidence to not only to Jamie's drivers at Uber, but also to the general public. And then I think also the R&D on batteries, I think that's so important. You know, the UK, through the Faraday Institute and other places, has got a real opportunity to lead here. So our focus is on customer experience, but there are a number of other areas where we do need some support. But we're incredibly excited about this agenda, and thank you for inviting us to join this panel.
Well, thank you, Peter. And now I'm going to see if Rachel, is it working from your end? Would you like to speak about your perspective?
Thank you, Charlotte. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Can someone nod? Yeah, fantastic. It's lovely to see Jamie again. We shared a panel just earlier this week, and thanks very much indeed to ConservativeHome and the other partners involved with this exciting agenda. Of course, I think it's a vital part of what we're doing, as a Conservative government, and I'm delighted to be the Minister of Decarbonisation. And also for the future of transport, these two agendas intersect. on this agenda. We are focused very strongly on a green recovery across government at the moment, nowhere more so than in this particular area. We recognise, as other panellists have said, that the emissions from road transport are very significant and we need to do more. We have talked for decades about phasing out of fossil fuels from motoring, but these changes are actually happening. And let's just stop for a minute and just reflect on how far we have come, because we have made significant progress. We've led the way in delivering clean growth between 1990 and 2018. During that time, our economy grew by 3/4, while carbon emissions fell by 43%, which was faster than any other G7 nation. So, so don't let people tell you that we are not leading the way in this vitally important work. We followed that in 2019, as you'll know, by making an ambitious commitment to end our contribution to global warming by 2050. And we don't underestimate the scale of that challenge. Battery electric vehicles represent nearly 5% of the new car market year to date, which is a growing figure, but we still remain the largest emitting sector. I think the latest figure is 28% of domestic emissions in 2018. So we do need to go further and faster. So what are we doing? In my department, we have been working on a new overarching transport decarbonisation plan. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it is quite groundbreaking because it is setting out for the first time how we will actually get to net zero. And we have to do it with partners across the transport sector, as the other panellists have highlighted. And it is great to see Uber and BP Chargemaster joining us on this work. So we do need to rapidly renew the road vehicle fleet with zero emission vehicles. This will deliver substantial emissions reductions over the long term. The government needs to play its part, and we are. We are already investing £2.5 billion to support the transition to zero emission vehicles, with grants for plug-in vehicles and funding to support charge point infrastructure across the country, because I do agree with what Jamie said. We know that we have to have charging available for people near where they live. But we do know that there's no time to lose if we're going to achieve our target. And this is where we get into perhaps some of the more challenging areas of policy development at the cutting edge of what we're doing and the thinking that we're doing in government. We've consulted on bringing forward the date when new petrol and diesel cars and vans are no longer sold in this country. We originally set out to do that in 2040. In our manifesto, we committed to doing that in 2035 or even earlier if a faster transition appears possible, and as well as looking at where do hybrid vehicles fit into that. We recognise it's vital that we have a package of support available to deliver that transition, to minimise the impact on businesses and consumers, and also to help the automotive industry to adjust. We're currently considering all of that, and we'll be able to say more as the spending review process continues. So, yes, of course, there are challenges in delivering this, but there are also huge opportunities for businesses in the UK to be at the forefront of this motoring revolution. I'm an MP in the West Midlands. We are at the heart of the sector. We're at the heart of the country, the heart of the manufacturing heartlands of this country in terms of the automotive industry. The global market for ultra low and zero emission vehicles is estimated to be worth over £7 trillion a year by 2050. And we are in an excellent position, a significant part of this, with our fantastic UK engineers, our innovators and our entrepreneurs. So our work in areas like smart charging and energy storage can help us to lead the creation of those emerging business models and help shape a market that's expected to see huge growth over the next 2 decades. So that the tool that we're doing this with in government is what's called OLEV, the Government's Office for Low Emission Vehicles. That sits between my department and BEIS. And we have pumped significant amounts of cash into this, up to £400 million, along with industry. And we're creating a diverse range of projects which has strengthened UK industrial and supply chain capability. We're supporting manufacturers, technology companies and academia to put the UK at the forefront of the design and manufacture and use of zero emission vehicles, because we do believe this is a great opportunity for the UK as part of our global Britain approach. So yes, we have supported, we have put cash in, we've announced money at the budget, and we'll see further investments going in to zero emission vehicles and the infrastructure, as well as your panelists have identified. We really do agree that there is a need for a rapid charging infrastructure network in England over the next decade. That's why we have committed £500 million in the budget to build super fast charge points located across motorways and major roads. So what people often don't quite appreciate is that we do have one of the best charging networks already in Europe. You may not know this, worth repeating. You are never further than 20 miles away from a rapid charging point on the highways network. That's the A roads and the motorway network already in this country. But it is vital that drivers have confidence in this network. And I think the other panelists have touched on that consumer experience. And again, this is work that we are in the middle of consulting on right now. It's a live exercise in looking to where do we need the market to do more, where do we maybe need to regulate more, where do we need to invest more, how do we get that working so that we have a great experience for everybody. So just to finish, yes, it is a really exciting time for us. It's an exciting, fast-changing industry. I am very privileged to work in this department right now. I've got a Prime Minister who's absolutely so enthusiastic and motivated about this, and so is my boss, Grant Shapps, passionate about green transport technologies and making them mainstream. What we want to get to is a world where traffic emissions don't pose a threat to human health or to our planet, and where motoring becomes part of the solution to climate change, and where zero emission cars are simply called cars. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And now Ginny. Oh, Ginny, you're on mute, by the way. Ginny, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Thanks, Charlotte. And thanks to ConservativeHome for inviting me onto the panel. Really interesting points there from Jamie and from Peter and from Rachel. And I suppose I come at it from a slightly different perspective to all of you. So I'm the founder of an advice site which focuses on electric car advice and ownership called electrifying.com. Now, I've been a broadcaster and a motoring journalist, gosh, for more years than I care to remember. I've written about cars and transport for magazines and newspapers. I've reported on the sector for various broadcasters. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I produced and presented a half-hour current affairs programme for ITV1, which questioned if the UK was ready for the mass uptake of the electric car. So I guess from my perspective on this panel, I'm the voice of the confused consumer. And really, you know, we've heard some really interesting comments there, lots of talk about manufacturers and industry and academia and policy. But please don't be under any illusions, because whilst government and business leaders like you are leading this transition to low carbon transport, at the moment, the majority of consumers are very confused and they simply aren't following you yet. I think when it comes to cars, I've always felt there was a slight disconnect between car advice sites and publications and the people who buy the cars. It's an industry that tends to be full of enthusiasts talking to other enthusiasts. I guess it's a kind of impenetrable club that you need a degree of knowledge to access. And I think when it comes to helping consumers make this transition to electric cars, that presents us with a real problem. So I've got an Auntie D. My Auntie D is brilliant. She loves her car because of the freedom that gives her. She's got zero interest in what platform that car is on, nor is she's willing to debate the merits of dual clutch transmission, as I'm sure none of you are. But on the flip side, my Auntie D won't consider a car because it's red or has a number plate with a nice name. She wants information relevant to her in a way that she can understand without having to have an engineering degree or a passion for cars. And I think when it comes to electric cars in particular, we're at danger of really underestimating what a big switch this is for consumers. The industry, quite frankly, has done a really terrific job of just confusing the hell out of everyone. You know, there are baffling acronyms all over the place. The language, just listening to us talk now, if somebody, you know, listening to this isn't au fait with it, it's really hard work. You know, FEVs, BEVs, HEVs, kilowatts. It's very confusing, so much jargon that we're asking consumers to get their heads around. And also crucially, we're asking them to form really, different habits, new habits, change the habits of a lifetime. Because owning an electric car needs a lot more thought, and it needs changes in our behaviour. And I really believe that if we're going to take consumers with us on that switch to an electric future, we've got to get the right information out there to help my Auntie Dee buy an EV, because she is the kind of person who is key to making this switch work. And that was absolutely my aim when I launched the company 6 months ago. It was to clear the air around electric cars, to democratise, to demystify them. So we teamed up actually with the AA earlier this year before we launched the brand, and I wanted to get a snapshot of consumer views towards electric cars. We did a large poll. It was 18,000 drivers. And in some ways, it was really, it was really quite exciting. It was really quite encouraging, because half of those that we polled told us that they will consider buying an electric vehicle when they next change their car, which was great. But then half of them went on to tell us that actually they don't know where to go for advice about them. And they find the advice that is out there really confusing and inaccessible. So I think from my perspective, one of the key things to making this transition work is education. We have to hold consumers' hands and guide them through this, and not patronise them, and not think they're silly because they don't understand the difference between a BEV and a HEV, because I think that's been a danger so far. It's become quite a cliquey industry, and it's a club that you're either in or you're not. So I think we really do need to democratise and open it up. I mean, the fact is that we all know we're far less likely to engage with information that we can't relate to. So I think the approach to education needs to be really engaging, all encompassing. We're starting really, I think, from a level playing field here. Even die-hard petrol heads don't necessarily understand the jargon surrounding electric cars. And I think education actually needs to start at school. It needs to start with engagement projects that link into the national curriculum. I mean, I think a couple of us have talked already about collaboration, and this is where I think we do need to collaborate. It's all of our jobs. And I think it's about, working across government as well, so that an education department is involved. This should be linked to STEM. It should be linked to the national curriculum. And I think the other issue for me is infrastructure. So one of the key things that came up in that poll of those 18,000 drivers was that the number one reason that was holding people back from switching to an electric car, that was a big concern, was the lack of public charging points. Nearly 7 in 10, 69% stated this as the main reason. If you look at that regionally, actually, respondents in Wales were most likely to say that the lack of public charging points was a barrier, 75% of them compared to all the other regions. And again, 70% told us that charging an electric car takes too long. Now, we know, and I know Peter, and BP Chargemaster are doing a fantastic job of rolling out infrastructure. I know we've heard from Rachel about investment that's been going into it. But the fact is, public perception is that they aren't there and it isn't enough. And I think part of that issue is because they're really hard to find. They're often in quite obscure places, like the dark remote corner of a car park. They're just not visible enough. You don't have to hunt down a filling station by looking on an app and following some directions, often out of your journey to find one. They are conveniently placed on main roads. We can see them, we know where they are, they're easily signed, and the same needs to happen for me with charging points. I think the other thing is they have to work all the time, every time. I'd quite like a show of hands from our panelists. When was the last time you went to a petrol station and you couldn't get fuel? Any of you? Has it happened recently? Probably not, has it? No. When was the last time I couldn't get a rapid charge? Yesterday. And probably 2 weeks ago, the last time I charged when I wasn't charging at home. I would say that 50% of the time when I go to a public charging point, there is a problem with that charging point. It is simply not good enough. It wouldn't be acceptable if it was down, if we were turning up at filling stations and 50% of them didn't work, we wouldn't accept it. And we have to switch that balance so that electric car drivers can get reliable charging when they need it, where it's convenient. So I think, in conclusion, from my point of view, from really trying to be here to be the voice of the consumer, giving consumers confidence and visibility in the infrastructure is key. And also education is key, holding their hand and guiding them through this confusion and helping them to change the habits of a lifetime. So I think those are my 2 key points.
Thank you, Ginny. Well, it's interesting you talk about the accessibility aspect, because we do have some comments coming through. So Alice says, it's great to say we're never more than 20 miles away from a charger, but what if you get there and there are only 2 chargers, one of which is not working, and there are 2 other people waiting? What happens then? And Mike Ballinger says, using petrol, I can fuel anywhere with any credit card. With EV, I have to think of multiple cards, networks, apps, internet, the real barriers to distance travel. So, so Jamie, do you perhaps want to pick up on that and talk about what ways business is going to respond to some of these concerns?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd just like to say, I think what Ginny said is completely right. I think it is primarily an educational challenge, and one of the things we do, because obviously we are enabling and trying to inform our driver base about what's the right vehicle for them. And one of the things that we do, which at the moment is London specific, is we have 8 individuals who are driving on Uber at the moment, who are driving in EVs, who've made the transition, and we call them our EV ambassadors. And what they do is they will every week sort of host fora to answer the questions that others have, and they will live in the areas where many of our drivers will live. So they'll live in Redbridge or Newham or Croydon or Hayes, and they will know the issues and they will understand the sort of problems and vagaries of which charge points do usually work, which don't usually work, how far can you actually drive on a 40 kilowatt battery, etc., etc. So one of the things we're trying to do from an educational perspective is for those who have made the transition, use them as the teachers of the rest of the driver community. When it comes to sort of charging, I mean, for us, because most of our driver partners will be driving within a city in a local area, so we tend not to they tend not to raise to us concerns about driving to Northumberland on the motorway and being unable to do that, because they will be in the city throughout most of the day. So therefore for us, the key things, as I said, is actually to try and make sure that they have access to vehicles that can do a day's drive as an Uber partner without having to recharge during the day, because and then to get them access to overnight charging, because if that happens, that's the optimal thing for everyone, because then they just need to know that when they get home, they can get access to a public charger near home without having to walk 2 kilometers, that it will work, and then when they start work the next day, that they can drive off immediately. Okay.
And Peter, did you want to expand upon this point? Obviously, BP is rolling out charging zones very rapidly. So what about the issue of multiple cards, networks, app, and internet? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are a couple of things here. I mean, obviously, you've got to make the customer interface as easy as possible, the digital interface. So we're working hard to make sure that you can just turn up with a credit card on our network and pay, because I think your Auntie D, Ginny, she might not have downloaded an app for a provider. It might not be her thing. So we've just got to make sure that the digital interface is as easy as possible. I mean, I think Ginny makes some really, really good points. I mean, clearly, the whole range anxiety issue is massive. And if we're not telling people they needn't worry about range anxiety, then they're going to have range anxiety. So I think, I guess if you look at it from our point of view, we've just got to get on as quickly as we can rolling out ultra-fast charging points. We've got to get on as quickly as we can on both the sort of the public Polar network that's part of BP Chargemaster, but also on our forecourts, because of course the petrol forecourt, the current forecourt is a familiar place to people. And by the way, you can also do other stuff. I mean, I'm not selling coffee or anything, but you can buy a coffee and you can buy some food and you can get your meal from the M&S stores that we have as well in partnership. But the key thing is to make sure that people know that there is, as you say, there are charging points actually at these sites. So I think there's a number of things more. The investment needs to come, and we need to get on with it. We need to make sure that the interface is as easy as possible, so we don't have kind of exclusive clubs that actually, and we're really working on that, so that you've got a simple digital interface in terms of payment. We've got to make sure that people can see where these sites are easily. And if it is a BP forecourt, for example, we've got to make sure that we signal to people where the charging points are, and how quick they are. Not, as you say, Ginny, using lots of difficult language about RFCs or UFCs or kilowatts. Just saying, for example, if you charge here for 10 minutes, you will have 100. On this car, whatever your car is, you will have 100 or 150 or whatever it is range. As a result of that. So I think there's a whole lot of things, but it's a really good point that you made, that the customer is confused.
Yeah, I thought that was a very good point about the confused customer, and I wondered, Rachel, what do you think we can do to reach out on the educational element of this, as Ginny talks about? How can we get people thinking about electric vehicles? Can we bring it into schools?
Yeah, I mean, look, definitely. I think Ginny sort of put her finger on a number of the barriers that we know are there. And she's absolutely right that if we don't get this consumer experience right, we won't get people to go on the journey with us. B, we will get a huge amount of sort of resistance, and we'll get people, who might want to change to an electric vehicle. As you say, Ginny, we know that people are interested in doing it. But if they see all these problems and difficulties, well, they're just not going to, because they're busy people, and yeah, they want to, get the right kind of car, but ultimately it's only one part of their life. We know that. So we have to be realistic and practical about what can we do. The things that you've put your finger on about the different apps and things not being compatible. I mean, look, I agree with you. I'm an EV driver as well. I've only had one for about 6 to 9 months, 6 months, something like that. And I've had the same experience as you at times. Of course I have, and any EV driver will have that as well. But on the upside, I've also had the kind of fantastically liberating experience of being able to plug my EV in at home and know that I will never have to go to a petrol station hardly ever again, because actually most of my journeys are quite short, they're quite local, except for when I go on holiday or something else. And actually that does mirror a lot of consumer behaviour. So that does point to, yes, we have to get the kind of home charging piece right. And that's where we have focused an awful lot of work. But just specifically on the consumer side, at the moment, there's a live piece of work going on, which is a consultation into all of this. And I've been working very closely with all the charge point operators and hearing what they think about it, how they can work together themselves voluntarily. And then we need to take a view on what do we as the government need to do to make it clearer, to either force them or legislate or whatever's necessary. So, when you see this consultation coming, please feed into it. We're delighted to have your views. And I think, yeah, absolutely. We know that education is definitely going to be part of this. The government has sort of run a number of education campaigns in the past, but of course it has to start in schools. But we also work very closely with the dealer network, and I think that's another key part. If you've got good dealerships, at the end of the day, consumer I don't necessarily, when I buy a car, I am really quite simple. I want to buy the right kind of car, etc. I don't need to know what's going on under the bonnet or how does a petrol pump work. You're right, I need to have a very clear and easy experience. It's easy to use, that fits into my life. And if you've got a good dealer who can do that for the customer, and they do that, and they are supported by government to do that, they should be able to hold their hands and walk them through it. this is it's not a new technology, but it's new to the mass market. So we are at the very beginning of that learning curve of adoptions. I forgot what it's called. It's the S curve, isn't it? But we definitely are at the beginning of it, and people are definitely going to feel, you know, some trepidation. And it is our job, all of us working together, to help them over that.
Okay, cool. So I've got a question from Mark McDonald, and he asked it's quite an interesting question about is the aim for individuals not to own these electric cars but to rent self-driving EVs where they are needed. But it's a more interesting point about rental. I wanted, Ginny, do you have any perspective on this?
I think it's a really interesting area, and I think that actually in the future how we own vehicles is going to change without a doubt. But I think for many drivers, that freedom of having your own car that is an extension of your life it's quite a personal thing, and we're not going to be ready to give that up for a long time. I think certainly in city centres, you know, we see car sharing, ride sharing working incredibly well in places like London, Manchester, the bigger cities around the UK. And absolutely, I think that there is a place for that in bigger cities. But I think for many of us, you know, look at my car, and it's my car. There's snacks in there. There's my makeup bag. There's half my wardrobe. There's the kids' toys. You know, it's not just about transporting me from A to B. It's transporting me in my life. And I think actually, for many of us, that is a way off. I think ownership is still very important for people and will be for quite a while to come.
Okay, and Peter, what do you think on that point? Will there be a rental revolution?
Well, I mean, I don't know, obviously, but I mean, I think we are looking certainly at more, you know, more car sharing, more ride sharing as we go forward. Definitely, you know, cities are encouraging that, and you know, as we start working more closely with cities around the world, you can see that is definitely the agenda. So I think, and if I just look anecdotally, you know, my own children, you know, who are sort of young adults, they don't aspire to own a car. They either borrow a car from us or indeed, you know, car clubs or whatever. So I do think the sort of, you know, the fact that the 2-car family with cars sitting on the drive or in a car park nearby that never get used, I think that model is changing. And cars will be much used much more, which has implications. But I think Ginny's right. I don't think this is going to happen tomorrow. I mean, I think and it varies country by country. I mean, some of the countries where we're active, like Germany, I think will be, you know, the car is pretty sacred there. But I think in the UK, I think you will see a shift, yeah, definitely over the next 5 to 10 years.
What do you think, Jamie?
So I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, the you know, habits are very difficult to break, and for those of us who are slightly older, you know, the sort of the rites of passage of getting or failing your driving license, then failing it again, and then getting it, and getting your first car are significant. But I wouldn't underestimate that, you know, whilst it's not necessarily changing in some for people who've gone through that process when a car was much more normal, actually, you know, for younger generations, vehicle licensing, you know, number of people under 30 getting car licenses has halved in the last 10 years. So very, very real changes are happening, but they don't necessarily change habits so much as change intergenerationally. I would also just say, you know, we should be very clear on the costs that car ownerships place on society. So, you know, the car is usually the second biggest purchase that a family or an individual will make. It sits empty 90 to 95% of the time. And in places like central London, 15% of geographic space is given over to parking spaces. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a very good use of financial assets or city assets. So you know, I think there's the change is happening, and there will be benefits from moving more into rental models, sharing models, and sort of mobility as a service model.
Well, and now we've got a question from David Dundas, and he asks, how will EVs help climate change if the electricity comes from fossil fuels? Maybe this is one you want to come back to, Jamie, because you'll know from your perspective how it all works.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not the expert, but I completely agree with that. I mean, the EVs will only be as clean as the sort of processes that create the electricity in the first place. So I'm sure Peter or Rachel would be much more informed on this. But you know, if we are generating it from coal or fossil fuels, that's going to minimise the benefits that we can get.
Rachel, what do you think about that comment from David Dundas?
Yeah, I mean, of course, on the analysis at the moment, government scientists and analysts in our department is pretty strong that the overall the overall carbon emissions of the whole life cycle of an electric vehicle compared to an internal combustion engine one is significantly less, even if you take into account everything in terms of making it. But at the moment, obviously, we have to also factor in the fact that we are increasingly using renewables in this country. I said right from the start that we've already dropped our greenhouse gas emissions by a significant amount, at the same time as growing our economy. The price of renewable electricity has plummeted. It competes in the market with traditional power sources, and that will only continue. But I do think there's points around the whole battery supply side. We do need to get to the point where we have our own gigafactory in the UK. That again is something that we're working on across government, and we've committed the funding to do that. The work is being driven out of Bays, and I understand there's a lot of positive progress there. And we also need to look at the sort of recycling side, which again, the Faraday Institute, I believe that we will get to the point where we can recycle these batteries and have our own supply chain of them, which clearly we do need if we're going to drive that mass adoption.
Cool. And we've also got a question from Derek Moore, and he asks, is EV our only priority, or do we need to offer hydrogen as well? Standards will be set by Japan, Germany, South Korea, and perhaps China and the USA. What do you think about this, Ginny? Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
It's a really interesting debate, the electric hydrogen debate. And actually, if I cast my mind back to the first alternatively fueled car that I drove, which was a very long time ago in the 90s, it was a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And I think for a long time then, the smart money was on the fact that we were going to all be driving around in fuel cell cars. And of course, that isn't where we are today. Look, there are fuel cell cars, they are out there. The infrastructure is my understanding, and Peter would know more about this than I would, but it's the infrastructure that is the really big issue. It's the storage of hydrogen and the delivery of hydrogen. I think there's only 3 places in the UK at the moment that you can actually fill your hydrogen powered car up with. I think where hydrogen becomes very interesting is if we look at heavy transport. So we look at heavy goods vehicles, we look at haulage, and I think that's where it could really come into its own on that side. But I think for consumers, for day-to-day driving, I think certainly my money is still on the fact that electric is where we'll go with that. But I do think hydrogen will play a really interesting role as we go down the future. I think we're talking a lot, aren't we, about collaboration, working together, and I think there isn't a silver bullet. The electric car isn't a silver bullet. There's going to be lots of different different things that need to come together, and hydrogen will undoubtedly be one of them.
And Peter, what do you think about hydrogen?
Well, I think perhaps I could also just make a quick comment on the first question as well about the grid. I mean, I think absolutely there's no point in plugging in a fantastic electric vehicle into a dirty grid, but that's not the situation we have in the UK, fortunately, because we've done so well with things like offshore wind and and solar and other things. But we're not done on that. I mean, we need to continue to decarbonize the grid, and the UK is in a great position in that respect, because we have the hard to decarbonize bits around the sort of the natural gas and things like that. We've got carbon capture and storage. We're an island with lots of seabed around where there's enormous opportunity to store CO2 under carbon capture and storage, and then create hydrogen economies in specific local areas. So I think we've got to continue to decarbonize the grid. Yeah, and of course, if you go to some other countries around the world where they're still regrettably over dependent on fossil fuels, of course the EV agenda might not look quite so attractive. And of course, there are naysayers that talk about the supply chain for electric vehicles having lots of other emissions in it. I mean, everything has a carbon footprint we need to get after, but electric vehicles in this country are definitely a good thing. I mean, we do know that the internal combustion engine will be around for a bit longer, so we need to continue to work on the carbon footprint of the fuels that we're going to be using. So, and the efficiency of the internal combustion engine as we transition. So, the rollout of E10, which we hope will be soon, and government's obviously be consulting on recently, and just general fuel efficiency in the internal combustion engine. We shouldn't lose sight of that. On hydrogen, absolutely. I mean, we're big believers in hydrogen. We intend to become a player in the hydrogen markets as they develop around the world. Of course, the issue with hydrogen, it doesn't occur naturally. So you either have to extract it from something like water, so-called green hydrogen, or you have to extract it from hydrocarbons, so-called blue hydrogen. The UK is, as I say, very blessed in terms of its ability to extract blue hydrogen through carbon capture and storage en route to a world of green hydrogen, I'm sure, when we have surplus renewable electricity. So, and I think, as Ginny said, I think hydrogen has a role to play, particularly when it comes to freight and heavy transport. We see very much electrification, EVs, as playing that role for private cars, smaller cars, but for freight and haulage, we think that hydrogen has an enormous future, actually. So we're quite excited about that, but it's a very early days, obviously.
Cool. And Seth Howells asks, how do we avoid a two-tier society where urban areas have that infrastructure for ride sharing, charging, etc., and rural doesn't? So Rachel, do you want to come back to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I totally agree that that's what we have to do. And I think this is sort of personal passion of mine, because I do represent a semi-rural constituency. We're not an urban area, so I see all this firsthand. It's absolutely essential that we enable people who do live in more sparse areas, who also don't have access to off-street parking, for example, to be able to charge their electric vehicles should they upgrade to one. So there are a number of sort of barriers around the infrastructure as it currently stands that we are starting to address. So one of the things we are doing is making grant funding available to councils to help them to install more charge points on their streets, whether at a hub or at a lamppost, so that people who don't have driveways can actually charge their vehicles at home, which is where we do know the majority of charging takes place. And what we're also doing is working really closely with MHCLG on the whole planning side of things. We have gone out to consultation at the moment on requiring every new build property to have access to have some of the wiring already in there for charge points. And also we're looking at the more sort of tricky issue, how do we retrofit existing buildings, workplaces, offices, garages and so on, where people may go to work or spend time, which don't currently have charging infrastructure. So clearly there's a lot to do in that area. And the point that the questioner makes about the urban versus rural, yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, we touched earlier on the sort of shared mobility, and I happen to think that there is a huge future for that. And what I'm doing in my role is running a lot of sort of innovation first competitions where new ideas can be funded before they're commercially viable, so that we're trying things out in different parts of the country around these. There's some really innovative stuff happening, and we do know that some areas, particularly some rural areas of Scotland, they are using car clubs already to great effect, EV car clubs. And what we want to do as a government is get where we see this good practice happening, things really working and people embracing it and liking it, then we need to be able to get behind that as a government and give that boost of government investment where the market isn't quite ready, to support people, to support those people who happen to live in those communities. And that is absolutely what we're doing and will continue to do.
And Ginny, what do you think about the two-tier society? Do you think we're on a road to that?
I think we have it already. If I'm brutally honest, we've got around 34,000 charging points, connectors in the UK at around 12,000 different sites. Only 2/3 of the UK has got access to home charging, yet over 50% of that charging provision of those public charging points are within the southeast and, interestingly, Scotland. I think there is little evidence today that the UK is really levelling up when it comes to infrastructure. We're in a situation where there are more charging points in Westminster than there are in the whole of the West Midlands. And I think the other thing that we're at issue, that's a potential issue, is charging speeds as well. So we haven't really talked about this much. So of all those different charging points, they offer wildly different rates of charging. And so it gets a little bit technical, a bit confusing if you're not an electric car driver. So there's different speeds of charging. So if you take a typical electric car, a Hyundai Kona, 64 kilowatt hour battery, around, I think it's 279 miles of range. Now, at most of the fast chargers in the UK, of which there are about 19,000, you will top up that car to 279 miles in around 9 hours, which is a very long time. Another 7,500 are classed as rapid chargers, which drops that charging time to an hour. And there's around 1,000 ultra-fast chargers, which I know, Peter, you talked about BP Chargemaster, are busy at work installing those. And that gives about a 30-minute rapid charging time. Typically, you can put about 100 miles of charge into a car in 10 minutes. And I think it's really crucial that these rapid chargers, the ultra-fast charging, which is what we need to really be able to get people charged and on the go, or to give people who don't have access to off-street parking the ability to charge quickly. It's really crucial that those aren't just in urban areas. So I was in Wiltshire working a few weeks ago, and all I could find across most of Wiltshire, there were lots of charging points, but there were very few which were in this 50 kilowatt hour and above bracket, which gave me a decent charging time. And even with those, it was taking me an hour to charge my electric car. So I think speed of charging is something we really need to think about. There's a lot of historic charging points out there that have been there for a long time that perhaps are out of date, that certain providers, and I'm not including BP Chargemaster in this, are really just letting them run. And it's absolutely unfair. We have a situation on the motorways in the UK, for example, where it can be very difficult to charge. It's very unreliable. So I think we really need to pay attention to the infrastructure, because I think already it's becoming an issue. And if we don't, then I think it could be a huge problem.
Okay, and Peter, did you want to add a comment about how companies can make the charging process faster?
Well, I think it comes back to my point. We've got to roll out more of our ultra fast chargers, and we're going great guns, and we will continue to invest. We'll continue to invest everywhere. We'll continue to invest on motorways. I think you're right, Ginny. There is a case for investment there, we've got to make sure that we don't have a two-tier society, because EVs are not cheap. We've talked about that will come down, I'm sure. But I hadn't heard that statistic about the West Midlands versus Westminster. I mean, that is, it doesn't surprise me. So I just think it's a question of us getting after, and the industry getting after, as many, charging points, number one, but particularly ultra fast charging points. If you're sure of doing 100 mile range out of a 10-minute charge, then that is pretty reassuring.
And And further to improving infrastructure, Matt asks, what do you need from highway authorities to speed up EV points and locations? So maybe you could continue along those lines, Peter.
Well, I think it's as I said in my intro. I mean, it's more about just making sure that, you know, we can connect to the grid. I mean, a lot of it's below ground, interestingly, you know, that we can connect to the grid. There's a standardized process, that there's a transparency of costs, the planning application for charging points. At the moment, that gets sort of lost in general, you know, the general planning application process. I wonder whether there's a case for a sort of prioritization for EV charging points, maybe in the planning process. So, so they're quite, you know, there are quite a few little things like that that we just need to try and unlock so we can speed up.
Okay, and demographically, I just wondered, like, is there any groups that you're specifically targeting? Is it more, what group is most buying? Men, women, age? Which group, Jamie, would you say is most tapped into the electric vehicle revolution at the moment? And who would you like to get into it more?
So can I almost go back? I was interested in the society piece, and I probably have more to say than I do on who's the early adopter of EVs. On the two-tier society piece, I think you know, it's interesting, and important for us that actually, you know, even within London, you can see very different levels of EV charging infrastructure. So, as Ginny said, you know, you've got very high rates in Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea, which is great for those owning a £70,000 Tesla. But actually, where our driver partners are, who we think will be the mass adopters for the reason I described earlier, they're in places like Newham, Redbridge, Croydon, Hayes, where the EV charging infrastructure rates are probably a tenth of that in Westminster or Kensington and Chelsea. So even within London, you've got tiers, and that's going to require local councils to lean in. When it comes then to charging in other cities, I mean, I think certainly we need to look to Rachel and to government to try and level up. But I think we also need a considered strategy about how we get the private sector to make the appropriate level of investments where the densities of EVs is low, and therefore the sort of the economics and the paybacks of investing in EV charging is less. And what I think is actually, you know, the early mass adopters of electric vehicles will be professional drivers, and every single small town across the UK has a small taxi fleet who are driving a lot, where actually the economics of moving into an electric vehicle will probably work for them before it does for many private car owners. And therefore there are ways, if you can get the EV flywheel going by identifying who are your early mass adopters of EVs, making sure that charging infrastructure is in the right place for them, you can then seed the infrastructure and grow it from there. Otherwise you don't quite get the flywheel going, and then no one upgrades into EVs because the charging infrastructure just isn't there. So it requires both a sort of public policy strategy and a government strategy, but also a way of identifying who within the private sector is likely to be the early adopter, in order that you can then make sure that the charging infrastructure and the vehicles are ready for them.
And we're kind of coming to a bit of a close now of our session, but I have one last question from Tim Wood, and he says, can anything be done to bring the very high initial electric car costs down? Ginny, do you want to offer some comments on that?
Yeah, cost is a really interesting one. And again, that poll that I talked about, it came up as a big barrier for consumers. I'm actually less concerned about actual cost, Charlotte, and more concerned about the public perception as cost, because look, electric cars are expensive at the moment, but we're only a couple of years away from price parity with electric cars in comparison with petrol or diesel cars. The big cost is the battery, which makes up around 30% of the cost of the car. I think, you know, what we need to start talking about though is total cost of ownership. We're focused so much on either the monthly price or the ticket price of the car. And actually we need to make a move away into thinking about standardizing things like total cost of ownership. So as an example, the new Peugeot E208, you can fill it up with 200 miles of driving range and off-peak electricity for £3.50. And I think it's those kind of facts and figures that we need to get out to consumers. And I wonder if, particularly now I've got Rachel's ear, whether standardisation of key stats to enable easier comparisons between electric cars and petrol and diesel, perhaps considering introducing new price labelling, just to better inform consumers about the overall cost. Because I think that that's key, is that people don't just look at this initial price or even the monthly price, they look at the overall cost of ownership when it comes to an electric car.
Rachel, did you want to respond to Ginny?
Yes, very much so. I entirely agree with Ginny. And I don't have the statistics of the original question about who are the early adopters, but I suspect, yes, they are people who are environmentally conscious and so on, and probably do have a higher disposable income, A, because they're buying a new car in the first place, other people will be buying a second-hand car. So, you know, we do, and we are already doing a whole government communications campaign, as I said earlier, but I think we just need to continue to do a lot more on that, because helping people to understand how does this actually compare in terms of their monthly salary, their monthly outgoings, what will they actually be paying to drive this new car compared to what they're paying at the pump. It is really, really important. That does come down to the education piece from government, but it does also come down to the retailers and to the industry themselves, who are, you know, they're up. It's in their commercial interest to make this case and to make it well, and to make it through their advertising budgets, which, you know, they will have to do. So, you know, when we bring forward this date, they will have a limited sort of time to sell off their older cars. They will need and want to start selling more electric vehicles. So there will be very strong market incentives for them to do a lot more around this cost piece. Plus, I think we as government can also do a lot around the whole standardisation of the charge points, the cost of charging, which we mentioned earlier as well.
Well, thank you. Well, sadly, we're coming to the end of the session. It's been a fantastic discussion. I'd like to thank Rachel, Jamie, Peter and Ginny for their time and insights. I'd also like to thank Uber for making this event possible, and I'd like to thank you, the audience, for watching and your questions. If you'd like to see this event again or share it with friends, it will be uploaded to Conservative Home's YouTube channel shortly. In the meantime, we hope you'll join for our next event at 7 p.m, which is about medical cannabis and the UK and how we can become a global leader in this field. In the meantime, have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thanks again to the panel.